podcast. I'm excited about tonight's show. I hope you are as well. So stay tuned. As we're diving into this, I want everybody to go check out Dr. M. David Litwa's books. He has Iesus Deus. I hope I'm pronouncing that correct. I always keep trying. I started to read this recently, and I'm actually blown away by this literature here. There are many, many books here that you should check out. I'm not just making that up. The Evil Creator. We recently did some episodes on this. Mind blown. I spoke to Dr. Price today, and his mind was blown after reading this. So Robert M. Price was like, whoa, wonderful book. But this book is the one we're going to be talking about today in particular, and a presentation will be shown. So super excited to hear from Dr. Litwa on that. He also has a blog where you can go check him out and read up on his material. I don't know how often he posts, but it's down in the description. So be sure to go check his blog out. And finally, we're past the appetizer to the main course meal. We're live, Dr. Litwa. This is the first time we've had you live here on Myth Vision. How are you doing in Australia?
Great, great. It's mid-70s here. It's a little bit more humid than usual. Well, as we say here, it's about 27 degrees, but that means that it's a very comfortable summer day. Good to see you, and I hope your holiday was good.
You too. It's only the past few days has it been chilly here in North Carolina. I've been walking out with a t-shirt, 70, 72 degrees. Shocking. Wow. I'm not used to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're not much different.
Exactly. Exactly. At least I'm not walking out and an apotheosis is happening and I'm ascending. I mean, that's a good thing. At least I'm still here.
Well, there'll be an apocalypse before that. Yeah.
Right. So your book and your presentation today, we're going to be talking about this specific book, and it's far more affordable at the moment. And I say to anyone, if you have a local library and you can't afford these books, go and they will get the book for you, so you don't have to spend the money. Highly recommend that for people who can't afford these. But if you can't afford it, I'm not kidding. I woke up this morning on page 0, and I'm now on page 167. Unbelievable material. You go through a vast history of scholarship on the topics, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say on your presentation. Maybe we jump into that, and then we'll get into Q&A. And if anyone has any super chats, I'm taking those as questions. We will definitely get to them when he's done with his presentation. So it's up to you when you're ready to start.
Okay, well, fantastic. Yeah, we'll just head right in. This is, as you said, a book that I published. It's been about 5 years now or so. This was actually my dissertation at the University of Virginia. It was great fun to write, and it's with a publisher who's giving a fairly decent price. I think it was $35 for the paperback and $27-ish for the Kindle. So I'm happy about that. This book, yes, is a bit weird, got a bit of a weird title, Iesus Deus. It's Latin for Jesus the God, or Jesus a God. It's the early Christian depiction of Jesus as a Mediterranean God. And how I came into this is I just, when I got to graduate school, it became more and more weird for me to think of Jews, or to think of, well, what were Jews and later Christians worshiping a human being, and a human being who is actually a Judean peasant human being. And this was especially struck me as odd because Christians, early Christians, appropriated all this anti-idolatry polemic from Jewish scriptures and from the Jewish subculture. And in this polemic, it's harshly forbidden to worship any creature apart from God. And this is, sort of like Religion 101 for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. But although Jesus is manifestly a creature, and Christians today don't in any way deny that he was a human being, although he was a human being historically, a peasant from Nazareth, small town in Judea, who most people in the ancient Mediterranean didn't consider special at all. And he doesn't really get any notice from Greek and Roman writers until the early 2nd century. This being is worshipped now by I don't know how many Christians there are in the world today, but I think around 2 billion. And this is the real striking fact, that here's a human being, a creature, who is worshipped. Now, of course, I know that you Christians also consider him a divine being, but he's also human, and his humanness isn't lost. And so here you have a religion based on the worship of a human being. That's the central figure. And that really struck me as odd.
Mm-hmm.
And so I began asking a question, and my thesis basically for this book is that early Christians deified Jesus in their literature for the same reason that other ancient Mediterranean peoples deified their heroes, rulers, and benefactors. That was I call it a thesis here. You might call it a hypothesis. And the way I tried to argue this hypothesis was that I tried to show how Christian writers represented Jesus in their literature, just like other contemporary writers, that is non-Christian writers, represented their culture heroes, their rulers, and their deified men. Mm-hmm. And as your viewers know, there were plenty of these. Some of their names are known. Some of their names will have passed out of human memory, and some of their names have been preserved in writings from which we can dig in and see about comparing. So in chapter 1, I kind of structure the book by Jesus's own life story as it's taught in the Gospels. And in chapter 1, I look at what I call the divine conception. In early Christians, some Christians today still boast that their birth story is different. Their divine birth story is different than others, for instance, in Egypt and Greece, because their birth story is non-sexual. In other words, it's although Jesus has a divine father, his divine father didn't have sex with a human woman, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is sort of like, here's how we're different. Our God didn't have sex, and this is viewed as a positive. Now, this has all sorts of implications about, gods and sex, and we can go into that. But this
can I just say what you said in your book that I think is fascinating?
Sure.
You said clearly this is diachronic, okay? So for people to really get the grasp of what you're saying here, you're taking not a synchronic approach, but a diachronic approach, which is meaning ultimately we're going to be dealing in a window of time here, ladies and gentlemen, that you can't go, necessarily 300, 400, 500 years earlier and build up this case. This idea is unique, but we also find it in a contemporary writing to what we see in our New Testament authors. Is it Plutarch, if I'm not mistaken, who you build this specific case? Maybe I'm jumping ahead of this. I don't want to jump ahead in your presentation, but I just want people to know that it's this diachronic, very window of time, which makes Christianity unique. But is it wholly unique? Anyway, lots of questions. It's so interesting. Please continue.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to talk about method. For some people, method is boring, but it's absolutely important to say that when you're doing the task of comparison, and our brains automatically compare. Our brains are comparing machines. So you will compare things in order to learn about anything. But the discipline, the scholarly discipline, is that when you're doing comparison and you want to figure out what is the network of influence, the point of comparison is not to jump like 4,000 years before Jesus and pull something out of like a Chinese myth and then say, oh, well, here's a connection. Mm-hmm. Well, there may well be a connection. I wouldn't deny that. But the point of the discipline comparison is to say, well, let's compare intraculturally, because here Jesus is born at a specific time and place. And although it's fascinating to also look at, modern mythology, African mythology, or South American mythology, or Australian mythology, although it would be fascinating to do that sort of comparison, and that's totally fine if that's your cup of tea, What we've got for Jesus is he's in a very specific culture, and what you can generate with intercultural comparisons is ways of making connections and truly understanding what was going on in the culture of the Gospels themselves. So when we read the Gospels, we read it in terms of 21st century American, European, Australian, African culture. And the task of comparison is to say, hey, let's pretend that our brain is in a time machine and forget about all that modern stuff and go back and to see if we can understand whether the gospel writers were speaking like their contemporaries were speaking. One of the most famous verses in Luke, which is in support of the so-called virgin birth, is this story right in chapter 1 where the angel comes to Mary and says that divine power and breath will come upon Mary, and it's in a non-sexual way, and that's how she's going to give birth to the Son of God. Now, I translate this power and breath. This is often translated power and spirit, but pneuma in Greek just means breath, and there's no necessarily religious connotation to pneuma here. It's a puff of air, and it's power, and that's what comes into Mary. Quite literally and physically, she is infused with breath. Okay, and so what's interesting is Luke's contemporary, a guy by the name of Plutarch, has a dialogue called Table Talk, in which he talks about the birth of Plato. Now, the interesting thing is, by very early after Plato died, his nephew wrote a dialogue in which Plato was the son of Apollo. And Plutarch, who's a good Platonist, says that, you know, I'm not comfortable with the idea that gods have sex, because for Platonists, gods don't change, and sex is a form of change, or it's a form. That's a funny way to put it, but that's how they thought. It's a form of radical change in desire and so on and so forth. So for Plutarch, gods don't have sex, and for any Platonist in this period, and really any higher intellectual, they would have denied that their gods have sex.
If I may, the reason that's why I said diachronic is simply to point out you're dealing with a window of Hellenistic philosophy, thought, and much more. This wouldn't have been the case 500, 600, 700 years BC, okay? They wouldn't have a problem with saying these gods literally had semen, and some of those ideas still trickle down into the first century. However, this, what you're discussing, is I guess you would say, this is the worldview that the New Testament is coming out of.
Exactly. This is also the religion of intellectuals. So the author of Luke is early 2nd century. Plutarch is early 2nd century. They're writing at the same time. They are competing intellectuals, okay, independent personalities who are in tune with the zeitgeist of what is intellectually plausible at their time. So yes, Greeks have a whole, you know, a bunch of stories about gods having sex. Plutarch would say, all of those are allegorical. Okay, none of those should be read literally as if gods actually have sex, because we know gods don't change and gods don't have sex. By the way, this Platonist heritage got inherited by Christianity. This is just a side note, so that sex and God basically became mutually exclusive, and they pretty much remain the same today. So I think it's fair to say that it would be offensive for Muslims, Jews, and Christians to say that their God has sex. That would just not make a lot of sense, because their God is a spirit or an invisible being who's never changing, etc., etc. That theology is what Plutarch is inventing in his day, okay? And that theology is taken up by a sophisticated writer, also known as the author of the Gospel of Luke. And what's interesting, what I found, and this was by chance really, I found that Plutarch and Luke actually use the same exact terms, that is power, which is Greek dynamis, and breath, which is Greek pneuma. They use the same exact terms to describe how Jesus's mother got pregnant on the one hand, and Plato's mother got pregnant. She was a lady named Perictione. And they're saying that there was a pneuma and power that came upon them, and that's how they got pregnant. And they emphasize this because it's a non-sexual way of talking. It's still physical, right? I mean, they actually believe that breath is a physical thing, and it can enter the body, and it can activate in a woman's uterus to produce a son, but there's no penis entering a vagina, and that was the important part. And that's what made this kind of story distinctive, okay? And so I'm not saying there's necessarily an influence or a direct connection, genetic connection between Plutarch and Luke. That would be interesting.
Mhm.
Very difficult to prove, not impossible. Right. But what's interesting is they're in a shared culture. They're both intellectuals. They both want to tell a story that's plausible to intellectuals. And so when they go around saying that, hey, our hero had a divine conception, here's how it came about. It was a pneuma and a dynamis that came from heaven and activated something in the woman's womb.
If I may, just so everybody knows, all the super chats, I'm going to get your super chats. Thank you so much for the support. The questions are amazing already. When we're done with the presentation, don't worry, this will be popped down. That way Dr. Litwa can actually see what's on the screen and he can do this. We're going to get a Q&A, but this is amazing. I mean, I can't tell you how awesome this is. Please continue, Dr. Litwa. I apologize. I just wanted everybody to hear that.
No worries. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2 looks at Jesus as a child, and all of this is just pure summary. That's much, much richer discussion in the book. What's interesting is early Christians knew stories of Jesus as a child. In fact, many stories of Jesus as a child, whereas in the Gospel of Luke, we have only one. But there were other Gospels, namely the infancy Gospel of Thomas. And this one is famous because it depicts the child Jesus as killing other children and severely injuring or killing his teachers who irritate him. And this has drawn a lot of attention because this is just fun stuff. And so my goal here was to say, well, modern Christians don't like this material, but why would a Christian write this in the 2nd century? And I began comparing how other child gods acted. And I looked at stories of Heracles or Hercules, and I looked at stories of Dionysus, and I looked at stories of Hermes as a young child. And it turns out they act in extremely similar ways. That is, their acts are utterly arbitrary and mean, and they end up killing people. So a good example of this is there's a story of Heracles who learns the lyre, which is a kind of musical instrument, from a guy named Linus. And Linus is his teacher, and Heracles sucks at this instrument. And he just, as a kid, he's trying to learn this. He's good on bronze, a little bit slow on brains, and he gets frustrated and takes the lyre and just cracks it over the head of Linus. And Linus dies. And Heracles goes off, and there you go. He kills his teacher. Lo and behold, in the infancy Gospel of Thomas, Jesus is portrayed as going to school with the other children and trying to learn the alphabet. And his teacher is saying to him, here's the letters, say alpha. And Jesus just will not cooperate. And it's hilarious, their conversation. But Jesus just, at one point, gets so frustrated with his teacher, he strikes him dead. And because he simply will not learn the alphabet, because he claims to be obviously Lord of the universe and the Logos. And so he already knows the letters and all the elements and the mysteries of the universe, etc., etc. But he kills his teacher. He even kills a kid who bumps into him on a crowded road, just withers him out of nothing. And these are very fascinating stories. What they show, I think, is that early Christians were in tune with how child gods act. And how do child gods act? Well, it's not utterly different than how adult gods act. If you insult the honor of a deity, that deity will come after you. And that's the basic point. By the way, this picture is Heracles, who as a kid is so strong, when 2 serpents are released in his crib, he takes both of them and chokes them. That's just a side note. I thought that was a nice picture.
Oh, wow.
Anywho, chapter 3, moving on, is about benefaction. Now, benefaction is a fancy word for doing extraordinary good. And this is how Greek and Roman and Jewish and Egyptian people tended to view the proof of a deity. If a deity was able to provide benefits, and we call these benefits today miracles, but they can involve anything like healing or feeding or saving in some sense, or answering prayer if you're in a shipwreck and you're drowning and you survive after praying to your deity. That's a benefaction, and that increases your loyalty to the deity. If you're healed by going to a temple, that increases your recognition of the power of your deity, and that increases your loyalty factor, your personal devotion. And it turns out that the gods who did the most benefaction were actually Roman emperors, because they were widely viewed as deities, called theoi, that is gods, and they had temples all over the Mediterranean world, and they were in the capacity to, when an earthquake struck your city, they could rebuild it. When there was famine, they could send food. They even had mystery rites and all sorts of rituals and sacrifices given in their honor. So the whole 9 yards here, that ability to give benefaction is the sign of a deity. And when Christians get around to emphasizing why they worship Jesus as a God, they emphasize this aspect of benefaction. And it's often the case, they got smart. Origen of Alexandria is a 3rd century theologian, and he got really smart about this because he knew that if he just emphasized Jesus's miracles, that he wouldn't be different than Asclepius, or he wouldn't be different than Dionysius, or he wouldn't be different than Heracles. But if Jesus provided something more as a benefit, specifically moral benefits, that is to increase the virtue of the converts, that was something very concrete for Origen to point to and say, hey, look, why do we worship Jesus as a God? Because he makes people moral. Now, occasionally you still find this argument that there's a sort of moral majority because religion makes you good and therefore it's true. And this argument still survives today. But in antiquity, this is a way for Christians to get one-upmanship on their Greco-Roman competitors, because one thing that they emphasized was that Greco-Roman deities aren't out there to make you morally good. Now, interestingly, that's not entirely the case, because Asclepius and Heracles were often moralized by philosophers to say that, hard work and endurance and purity, having those virtues does produce sort of a new way of living. And that's also somewhat similar to what Christians were saying. Not exact, but somewhat similar. Chapter 4, I look at the Transfiguration. And the Transfiguration, you've got a nice little depiction of it in your intro, is that story where Jesus goes up on a mountain and his flesh turns to light, and it blinds his disciples, 3 disciples, and he is recognized as the Son of God by a voice that comes out of heaven. This is an extremely common structure of a tale. So, for instance, gods in the Greco-Roman period are known very often to spend time among humans in human guise. One of the most famous quotations from the Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey, is that the gods dwell among human beings in disguise, keeping track of their behavior. Occasionally, when these gods wish to reveal their true nature, there's what we call an epiphany, in which the deity is typically revealed in light with other manifestations of power. And there's a very neat structure here that's followed. The deity is revealed in light, there's a response of fear, but there's also worship. And then a confirmation of the deity, whether through some sort of voice where sometimes the deity herself or himself just says, I am the Son of God. And this happens with Demeter, it happens with Dionysus. It's very common in tragedy and in poetry.
If I may, just to let our audience know, I just put the link to his book in the comments, but I'm telling you, if you want the like you want the sources, some of the pages have more sources in the footnotes than words that are in the page. So the point is if you want the evidence for these claims, it's all in the book. Go get the book. Anyway, please continue. I had to let everyone know, because you're gonna say some things, and we're skipping so much of what you've actually written on this. Oh, got to get the book. Got to get the book.
Yeah, this is just a very quick summary. But basically, that same structure of the Epiphany scene for a Greco-Roman deity or a Greco-Egyptian deity, where you have the explosion of the god's flesh, the lighting in a ball of light or blazing glory, and then a responsive fear, and then a responsive worship, and then this proclamation of deity, that is so common. And when you look at the structure of the Transfiguration, that's exactly the structure that every single Christian writer follows. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that's exactly the structure that they follow. So they know the Epiphany scene very well in their literature, and they're letting you know, hey, this is the Epiphany for us. Chapter 5 goes into resurrection, and this is a very touchy topic because it's often told that Greco-Roman deities don't resurrect. And when I looked at this, that's a kind of half-truth. It is actually well documented that Greco-Roman deities and heroes are sometimes deified by undergoing violent death in post-mortem vindication. And they undergo, after this post-mortem vindication, what I mean by that is that they are raised by being immortalized in their bodies, so that their flesh does fall away, but they rise to heaven in an immortal body. And I call this not resurrection, but corporeal immortalization, which just means it's the making everlasting the nature of the body. And this is the body that Jesus appears after his resurrection. It's a body that can no longer die. You can stab it, you can shoot it. It's not going to die anymore. And that's the body which is fit to rise to a heavenly ecology. Because the way that the ancients thought was that on earth, you have an ecology that's fit for earth. So you're made of flesh. But in heaven, you're made of another material substance called pneuma. And that substance is what your body is made out of. It's the same substance as the stars. So when Greco-Roman deities, and Asclepius, Heracles, and Romulus are my primary examples. Asclepius, as some of your viewers probably know, was fried by a bolt of lightning. Then he was raised up in a renewed body, and he became one of the most common Greco-Roman deities in all of Greco-Roman antiquity, or right around the time of Jesus's lifetime. He, in other words, was a guy, a human, a son of God, to be sure, son of Apollo, and he was immortalized to become a fully fledged god who was then active in temples all throughout the ancient Mediterranean. Very similar is Heracles, who was burned alive after putting on a shirt that his wife mistakenly, she thought it was a love potion, but it was actually a poison. She put this on her shirt. He wore the shirt. It ate his flesh. His flesh literally turned to mush. In order to hasten his death, he burned himself alive on top of Mount Eta. And after his flesh dissolved, his immortal body was raised. Typically, he's shown on a 4-horse chariot. And that god existed for Greeks and Romans. Heracles was one of the most popular gods in all of antiquity. In fact, today when we want to swear, we say Jesus. In antiquity, if you wanted to swear, you'd say Hercules.
No way.
So that's how they did it. Romulus is specifically a Roman deity, but his story was so well known that one can definitely, I think, say that intellectual Christian writers of the 2nd century would have been familiar with this. Romulus is giving a speech outside of Rome in what's called the Campus Martius. He's giving a speech. As he's giving a speech, a huge storm comes up, a lightning storm, and it's pitch black, and people run in all directions because of the lightning and the rain. And when they get back together, Romulus, who was sitting on his throne, was gone. And the story was that he rose to heaven, and he actually came back after his ascension and had a chat with a guy named Proclus Julius, who then made a formal witness statement in the Roman Senate that Romulus is now a god, and therefore he's worthy of worship. And a temple to him was established, and it was still at this temple. This temple was still standing along with Romulus's hut during the time of Jesus, and for as long as Rome was a city up until very late antiquity. So very well-known figure. All three figures are corporeally immortalized. All three figures are previously human. They all are deified, and they all become actively worshipped figures right around the time of Jesus. Chapter 6, finally, is what I call theonomy. And theonomy, it has nothing to do with law in my sense. It has to do with receiving a divine name at your ascension. And I found this, I found this because in Philippians 2, if some of your readers or your viewers are familiar with this, Philippians 2, Jesus receives a new name when he rises to heaven. And that new name causes all three levels of reality in the universe to bow down to Jesus and to worship him in his new status. And this new name is Kyrios, or Lord. And it's widely taken to be the way that early Christians pronounced the name Yahweh. So Jesus receives the name of Yahweh. He is therefore worshipped as Yahweh, and in that capacity becomes Lord of the universe. So I looked at other sources, and it turns out this is extraordinarily common. Back in Egypt, pharaohs received divine names at their coronation, which for them was also their deification. They received 5 divine names, and these names almost always incorporated names of previous gods, such as Horus, etc. Greco-Roman rulers also received divine names when they were deified. For instance, Mark Antony, was known as the new Dionysus. Nero, we have inscriptions of him as Zeus the Savior. So it's surprisingly common for Greco-Roman rulers, the emperors, just to be called out and out Zeus. And this is really quite extraordinary, and it's preserved today on hundreds of stones. Jesus, as I said, also receives a divine name at his deification, which is also, in a sense, his coronation. It's when he assumes his status as Lord of the universe, as sitting at the right hand of God. Just to wrap up, in the conclusion, I finally conclude that after all compiling all this literature and doing all this comparative work, it seemed to me that it was safe to conclude that Jesus was actually a fairly typical deified person in Greco-Roman culture, and it made sense for early Christians to worship him. It indicates that Jews and Christians, even if they formed distinct subcultures, were part and parcel of that Greco-Roman culture, and that they thought in broadly Mediterranean terms, so that they weren't separated off in some kind of weird isolation tank and not in contact with the other dominant cultures of their day. They were part of it all. And I suppose the other take-home point of this is to say it was logical for early Christians to worship Jesus after reading the Gospels, because the Gospels gave people reasons for believing that Jesus was a God. And those reasons were exactly the reasons that any other Greco-Roman person would worship a God at their time. The big question today is, do those reasons even make sense anymore? And why do Christians today continue to worship this human creature from Nazareth? That's it for me.
Wow. I had to unmute myself there. That was really, really fun. And that was a drive-by. We were just we were 40,000 feet above Earth, and we just flew past the little location. You can barely see it. Trust me, get the book. I'm not kidding. We're going to go to Q&A here in just a second, but I wanted to say something that I found fascinating that you didn't get into, and I'm glad you didn't. Like you said, people would get bored probably, but I'm going to say why I'm not bored about this. I am inviting scholars from every field of research on this channel. Literally. I mean, they might even be the opponents of your view, right? And I have them on. This is what I do at Myth Vision. But you engaged with the whole idea of, how do I put this? Judaism becomes the scapegoat. And it's this like apologetic savior of let's save it from Greco-Roman influence. Let's save it from, and like you point out one of the scholars who's kind of hypocritical in this, and they're saying like, look, Hellenism had completely consumed Judaic thinking for the past 3-4 centuries before the first century. And by the time we get in the first century, everything you know of as what we call Judaism, which may be anachronistic, is Hellenized. So you're not engaging with, well, we either have Judaism or we have Hellenism. It's not either or. And I want to get that thinking across, because the more I look into this, it just becomes apparent what you're saying makes the most sense, in my opinion. So that's my compliment. Yeah.
Thanks, Derek. And I can say a word about that. And because it is, one has to be careful. But my overall hypothesis was that one of the reasons that early Christian scholars like Judaism is that it serves as exactly as you said, the term I use is buffer. It's like a military buffer, because a Christian apologist is usually going to call the Greco-Roman and Mediterranean stuff, which is simply the dominant culture, they're going to call it by that nasty word pagan. And pagan has all these negative nuances. And what the apologist wants to do is to say, well, Christianity and paganism, never the two shall meet. Christianity was its own revelation, purely descended from heaven, and bada bing, bada boom. That very apologetic way of putting it does violence to history. And there is a kind of, one has to say that, listen, first of all, folks, Judaism, what you're calling Judaism, had been part and parcel of Greek and then later Roman culture for hundreds of years before Jesus was born. Let's just be honest here. There are Jewish distinctives. No one wants to deny that Judaism was a very distinctive subculture with its own distinctive rites and customs. Nobody wants to in any way say anything bad about Judaism. But it wasn't isolated, and ancient Judea, just like modern Israel, is a modern Western country. You go there, they all know who Superman and Batman is. They're not in some kind of bubble, okay? Same thing in antiquity. You know, that's how they thought. And so when if you say that, well, Christians weren't affected by the larger culture because all the first Christians were Jews, that doesn't make any sense at all, because the Jews were inside the bubble of Greco-Roman culture. You know, I mean, and this is just so important for people to keep in mind, that these kind of boxes, airtight boxes that we think set up as like, here's the Greco-Roman stuff, here's the Jewish stuff, here's the Christian stuff. Yeah. And the Christians are within the Jews. So the Jews protect the Jewish culture protects Christianity from being affected by that dominant Roman culture, which is bad, because those are not true gods, right? That's the apologetic move. It makes no sense at all.
This gets even, I love what you did in the book. I got to shut up after this and go to the super chats. I'm so excited about what I read. I spent all day. I mean, I took breaks from my brain, but 167 pages I got through. I got to the point of we believe in a resurrected hero, or the idea of the resurrection of a god, you know, got to that chapter, and I'm almost done with that one right now. But I'm so fascinated. The one thing I'll say is, if this weren't the case, the engagement of early church fathers would not have been seen the way they are. All you got to do is read them, and you'll find out real quick. They're engaging with what they all know. They know the Superman and the Batman and the Hercules and Asclepius and Romulus. They know these things. They're engaging, and they're using them as an apologetic. They're saying, look, no different, but we do have a one-up on you. Our Lord is a little better. And this is why we should come on and worship with us. You know, like it's a clear thing. So Doc, thanks for the super chat. Let me shut up. I got to go up here to the top because I can never, I couldn't even cover everything. If we went for 10 hours right now, we honestly would not be able to touch everything that you talk about. It's that good. All right. I'm going to the tippy. Thank you for all the help, the super chats, the compliments, the criticisms, you name it. You know, we're here to learn. And thank you so much. Indo, see how it pops up? I told you it'd be on the screen. All right, Indo, thank you for the super chat. Do any of these similar gods, like Zalmoxis, Osiris, Romulus, for example, leave empty tombs, eyewitnesses, martyrs? Were they real people?
Well, that's a fantastic question. And yeah, so I go through all this material in chapter 5. Absolutely, there's something similar to an empty tomb. And the story that I raise is for Heracles' mother, who's a lady called Alcmena. Alcmena is sort of like, she's not quite the status of the Virgin Mary, but she's very important as the mother of Heracles. And she dies, and several decades later, actually quite a while later, her tomb is open, and they go in, and instead of finding a body, they find tomb tokens indicating that the body was there, but that the body had effectively disappeared and had ascended to heaven, to an age, and there she reigns from the clouds, so to speak. So for Greeks and Romans, Alcmena, again, not a household name, but was a very historical person. They wouldn't have thought like modern people think, that no, this is just mythology. No, she was a historical person, because Heracles was a historical person, right? And he was a guy who was deified. Romulus is an interesting case. He doesn't leave behind a body. He disappears, and then later comes back in a sort of epiphany situation. But the next Roman ruler, Numa, interesting case with him. He's buried, and then hundreds of years later, they crack open his tomb. And again, it's a case of disappearing. There's just nothing there, which indicates that he was translated to heaven. And the only thing that was there was his books. And these books were then burned by the Roman Senate. And this is a story that is told by Roman historians. So they certainly believe that it occurred.
Wow. Yeah, just to zero in on that real quick there, there's this tomb narrative that, is there anything to this? Me and Gnostic Informant, Neil, my buddy, go subscribe if you haven't subscribed to Neil. We've had like plenty of talks before, and this is my question that I'm to the next super chat. In Acts 17, you have this Socratic Paul. He's like he's given this speech. He's doing something that is both worlds fused, if you will, which is clearly within the bubble like we're talking about. And then he says, as your own poets have said, we too are the offspring of the gods. Talking about Zeus. If we get to Epimenides, he's talking about Zeus. And maybe that's a quote from another person as well. I know Epimenides makes this quote. But it's the idea that the Cretans believed Zeus died, and here is this tomb for Zeus. And he's saying, no, you fools. He's not dead. He's alive. Do you think this plays into this whole resurrection narrative with Jesus? And I don't know. What do you think the polemic there is in Acts 17? Is that a whole show in itself? I mean, maybe I'm opening up a can of worms here.
Well, it could be. I mean, you can always dig deeper into these very specific nitty-gritty stories, and that's really important to do. You just don't spout generalizations. You have to look at the individual stories. For Zeus's tomb on Crete, yes, it was well known in antiquity that Zeus had a tomb on Crete, the island, and he most people, well, I should say not most people, but a good number of intellectuals believed in a theory called euhemerism. And according to euhemerism, the Greek gods were just very, 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 very ancient culture heroes. That is, they were human beings who once lived. They were great kings on earth, and they gave benefits, like Dionysus founded the vineyards and taught people how to make wine. Demeter was sometimes called Ceres by the Romans, also gave grain, showed people how to grow grain, and this is why she was later deified. Zeus gave tremendous benefits. He was a world, sort of a globe trotter, benefiting cities, creating civilizations. And then at some point he died, and his tomb is on Crete. But he was also the king of the gods, to whom he had dozens of temples in the Greco-Roman world. People prayed to him on a daily basis. People believed in his literal existence, expected him to make an influence on their lives, just as they do today. I mean, it's not entirely, or just as they do for Jesus today, I should say.
Right.
It's not entirely different than, yeah, people go to the tomb, people go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which just means tomb, in Jerusalem today, but they also pray to Jesus as a living deity who lives in heaven. And you could do the same thing. It wasn't necessarily cognitive dissonance. A Greek who knew very well that Zeus had a tomb on Crete could still go to a local temple of Zeus and pray to him as a living deity.
Thank you so much. Gnostic Informant, thank you for the super chat. Do you think the Hellenized world post-Alexander the Great plays a role in the mixing of Greco-Roman pagans and monotheist of Judea Zoroastrian?
Yeah, so if I understand this one, there's definitely a lot of mixing of cultures and subcultures. The model, I mean, this is just an analogy, but it's sort of like Americanism. You know, everywhere in the world you can go and there's a McDonald's. What Alexander the Great created was a world in which you had a mega culture, which was absorbed, that is the Hellenic culture, which was absorbing all aspects of other cultures and religions, and presenting itself as the dominant political force all over the Middle East and across Asia, really as far as India, and then as far west as Spain. So yes, absolutely, there were all sorts of religious people who got to exchange ideas, because there was also a tremendous movement of peoples, and there was colonization. Greeks would move into an area, create a city in the Middle East, as far as Bactria, which is right near India, and Alexandria in Egypt is a great example. It's Egyptian, obviously, city, but it's a Greek town, and the main language is Greek, and they're interacting with Greek. So absolutely, there's a mix of people, and yes, those people include Zoroastrians, followers of Zarathustra, because one of the main areas that Alexander takes over is Persia. He dies in Babylon, so he's definitely familiar with that area. There's stories of the Magi visiting Alexander and so on and so forth. Monotheists, I don't use the term monotheism, but just because it's sort of like a Christian charged apologetic term. I prefer other terms like sumo deism. That is the view that, you know, there's lots of divine personages, saints and angels and so on and so forth, but there's one chief God, and this was a very, very common view in antiquity, and you'd have a hierarchy basically, and this view continues to survive today. And yeah, that's the short answer.
Thank you so much for that, Neil. I appreciate it. Go subscribe to his channel. How do you feel? There's 433 people watching right now. Isn't that pretty cool?
Great. Thanks for staying up. Yeah.
Yeah. Quite a bit of people. You know, I had a compliment from, as we get to the next super chat, from Steve Mason. You know, he taught at I can't remember the college, but he taught there for like 17 years before he resigned and put in his retirement. And he said, Derek, in the first week of the first video I did, more people willingly and voluntarily clicked to watch this video of me giving a presentation than I've ever taught in real life, ever in person as students. So he's like, it made me feel really good that there was that many people who are voluntarily, willingly wanting to learn this material, not saying, I got to take this class so I can get, you know, I want to get my master's and this is just part of the course that I'm not really interested in. No, people want to hear what you have to say. So, and I do too. So thank you for your time.
There's a hunger for truth and good scholarly, well-researched information, and it should be available. So thank you.
Thank you. I want people to just push this out there, share this with somebody, get someone to get the book, read this. And it's highly, highly educational. Critical Faculty, thank you so much for the super chat. He also has a YouTube channel. He's interviewed with me, Neil, all sorts of people. We want a community of people who have like minds. So go subscribe. No questions, just for the mighty effort, Derek and David. Well, thank you. I appreciate the support. I really do. Next super chat is Zachary. Thank you so much, Zachary. I don't even want to butcher your last name. I think I say Lahaki every time. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I always forget because there's so many people that I try to pronounce their names right. What does the pagan parallels between Jesus and other gods do for the Jesus mythicism versus Jesus historicity debate? It seems to me this is more compatible with Jesus being mythical. What do you think, Dr. Litwa?
Well, again, that's a really excellent question. And the tendency, I think, will be, especially for those who have a pull toward the mythicist view, to use the Greco-Roman parallels and to question the existence of Jesus. And to my mind, that's not, and I go much more into this in my book, How the Gospels Became History, but to my mind, that's not necessarily the best path to take. The reason being is that there's a confusion in that what we refer to as Greek and Roman mythology was to the ancients just plain history, okay? So they all believe that Heracles had a literal historical existence. Same thing with Asclepius. He was a real dude. Zeus, all your favorites, okay? They weren't like Spider-Man. I mean, maybe people today think Spider-Man is real. I don't know. But they weren't fictional, right? And so in the modern mind, there's a little bit of confusion that, well, if you're comparing Jesus to other mythological figures, that means that Jesus is probably a mythological figure himself. But that's only a modern person would think that way. An ancient person doesn't view any of those figures as mythological. That is, they're not fictional in any way, shape, or form. So what I'm doing is, by entering into the ancient mind, is comparing all historical figures, okay? And I'm assuming for the moment that Heracles is a real dude, okay? So, because I'm trying to think like an ancient person. And so making comparisons with Jesus and Heracles is the same thing as making comparisons with Jesus and Apollonius of Tyana, who's well recognized as historical. Now, that being said, it's absolutely the case that someone can become mythicized. That is, a historical person can become mythicized, and it's perfectly logical to think that, well, you know, I don't believe in Heracles. I mean, maybe they did back then, but I don't anymore. And so the same thing with Jesus. Well, I mean, it's all a matter of evidence, right? So you'll have to go and actually look at the evidence for Jesus's existence, and make your own decision. Comparison isn't really designed to deny someone's existence. It's designed to understand how ancient people thought about Jesus and why they concluded that he was a deity, which today really makes no sense at all. I mean, if you think of it, when people, or an atheist or someone who's never read the Bible, reads the Gospels,
right,
it just makes no sense at all why you would worship this figure. Or I should say, speaking personally, I don't know why you would. And I don't know if the reasons that the ancient people did would be the same reasons as modern people do. There's some overlap, but actually it's fairly different way of thinking. So it's really surprising that you have a deified and mythicized figure. And I'm really not overly interested actually in the existence question, because ultimately I don't think that it makes a huge amount of difference. But
yeah, I agree.
I'm willing to be corrected.
No, I'm at the end of the day. Yeah, I'm with you. All roads lead to Rome, and it's the same thing. You have 2.3 billion Christians who still believe this is a real guy, who's really God, who came down and such. So at the end of the day, the question really ultimately, whether there was a guy or not who was mythologized, or whether he was divine, pre-existent according to some angelic lore and according to a fictional narrative, or is believed in the minds of Paul that this is an angelic figure who somehow consumed flesh, was manufactured, as like Richard Carrier, other people take. At the end of the day, I don't think it really matters at the end. But if you want to get down into the details, I guess you can die on certain hills if you really want to. I don't die on a hill because I don't know the answer to this question fully. I'm still like, I don't have certainty. I lean that there was a guy. I lean that there was definitely a guy that was mythologized, but I could be wrong. I could be wrong. I'm not saying
the goal. The goal of scholarship is not to be an apologist, and you can be an apologist for anything. And if you're using the non-existence of Jesus to be an apologist for atheism, then in effect, in terms of strict logic, you're no better than a fundamentalist apologist, because you're just twisting reasons to prove a point that you already believe, and that there's nothing that would really shake that belief. The point of scholarship is to say, let's just have fun with this stuff. Let's learn as much as we can. Let's not have a point. Let's not be dogmatic at all, and just say, here's a bunch of cool stuff. Let's learn about it as much as we can, because that provides light and intelligence and produces good conversations. And we don't have to die in a ditch for these issues.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And definitely, I got to say this just because I have this zeal to try and help people who were in fundamentalist circles. So I may come off, if you will, with kind of this, I do have the motive and bias of trying to help people see that these ideologies, especially fundamentalist ones, I'll say, are harmful. That could be true on the other side, though. You can see some people unhealthily flipping the other side and going hardcore, like militant in the other direction. And that zeal, might be driven for whatever reason, whatever the motives are. But I'm trying to remain balanced by still enjoying the literature, the lore, the myth, get into the narratives, comparisons. I love all this stuff. At the end of the day, there's the people who are going to hate me in the chat that will come into my comment section, will absolutely despise me. And those are the people who are typically fundamentalists in some sense, or aren't really like open-minded to letting other people have different views, if that makes sense. So, what do you do? Lauren Jones, thank you for the super chat. I really appreciate it. Can you tell us about the treatment of Asclepians? Is there any reference to lucid dreaming that you found? The Mithras liturgy sounds a lot like Vedic and Tibetan sleep yoga.
So Asclepius is a very, very, very common Greco-Roman deity, very, 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 very popular, especially in the 1st and 2nd century, right when Christianity is getting started. Yes, absolutely. The way that you access Asclepius is you go to his temple and you have a nap. You have a sleep. It's a sleep session. It's called incubation. And in that incubation period, by spending the night in the temple, you are expected, after certain sacrifices and rites, to have a dream. The God will come to you in a dream. So it's definitely lucid dreaming. I think that's a fair description of it. And there are thousands upon thousands of stories of people being healed in these dream contexts, where the God will appear to them, sometimes in his normal form as a large bearded man, but sometimes in other forms. And he will touch a certain part of your body, and he will take care of you and heal you, and then you will walk out of the temple whole. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of stories written on stone and papyrus of Asclepius healing real people at this time. Mithras liturgy is a whole nother can of worms. That's from a Egyptian text, and that's not a dreaming context. The ritual practitioner there is wide awake and doing rituals which involve an ascent to heaven. Now, you could argue that he falls into some sort of trance. Absolutely. We're not really sure what's going on. But he describes this ritualized ascent to heaven in which he sees very definite deities, including Mithras, who's just, in this case, a version of the sun god. And what this looked like on the ground, boy, your guess is as good as mine. Did this person go into a trance with their eyes rolled back? I don't know. I really don't. I wish I did. But thanks for your question.
Yeah, it opens up the door of like, how often would a mind-altering substance play a role in some of these acts? Because you don't necessarily need one, but there are times where I think that plays a significant role. You want to take off to outer space? Well, here, drink this little stew that we give you, or whatever, this drink. Off to outer space we go. Doc Pleroma, thank you so much for the super chat. Could the parable of the rich man be mimetic of the cynic view of wealth and autarkia in Lucian's downward journey? I don't know how to pronounce that. How do you pronounce that?
Yeah, autarkia. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. This is a this is a really specific question. Thank you.
I have a smart audience. I'm telling you. I should have warned you. Did I not yet?
Yeah, autarkia just means self-sufficiency. So just making sure that you're not dependent on any other thing for your happiness.
Right.
I'd probably need a bit more background information to answer this in any intelligent way, but it is definitely the case that Lazarus in this parable of the rich man is an extremely poor individual who then goes to heaven, and the rich man goes to hell, as many of your listeners know. I mean, it would be a question of is Lazarus in any way look like a cynic philosopher? And maybe all we know about him is that he was homeless, and many cynics were homeless, and that the dogs licked his sores, so he was diseased and extremely poor. I have not, in full honesty, in a long time read Lucian's Downward Journey. But basically, Lucian is this sophistical writer who makes fun of other philosophies. But in so doing, he gives us a lot of nice information. I wouldn't describe it as mimetic. I think you'd need more data, and I'd be happy to hear more from you. I think that you'd need more data about what exactly Lazarus's lifestyle was. What did he go around with a certain view of life, a philosophy of living self-sufficiently, carrying nothing, owning nothing, preaching a certain morality, a strict ascetic discipline, like we know other cynic philosophers did? The story just doesn't say anything about that. So apologies.
Let me ask you this about the rich man, where this is something Dennis brought up, that he thought there was something here, whether it's mimetic or it's a lift from just having these ideas in the culture, is when Lazarus looks up Abraham's bosom, the rich man, I apologize, looks up and he's saying, just touch my tongue with some water. That's it. Is this potentially a lift or an image of Tantalus in the lake, where he's like, the water's right there, the food is right there, but they can never get it. It just never satisfies. It's always this hunger for thirst and food. And here's Tantalus in this lake, tantalizing. Yeah. What do you think? You think there's something there?
Well, I do think in terms of the larger general culture of doctrines of a negative afterlife, what we think of as hell situations,
right,
that there is some cultural overlap, that hell, or the Greek Hades, is a place where you're extremely thirsty. That's a cultural common knowledge kind of a thing. And that extreme thirst is also an afterlife punishment, is something we find quite frequently. But again, to draw a mimetic relationship, which is a genetic connection, you would just, in my opinion, need more data. I would say in the case of the rich man, he thinks that just one drop of water, less than a drop, will satisfy him. And if what's intriguing is that he doesn't get the drop, and that's, I guess, the greatest parallel to Tantalus.
Right.
But mimetic would have to mean that the author of Luke is thinking of the Tantalus story when he's writing this. Possible, but difficult to prove.
Thank you. Lauren Jones is back. Thank you, Lauren Jones, for the super chat. These tropes are beautiful in Vedic traditions too. Birth of Ganesh, Nachiketas, 3 days with death. Have you read the Guatemalan Mayan Popol Vuh? I don't even know. I'm throwing words out there trying to pronounce this.
No, I'm very impressed, Lauren, with your knowledge, and you're going far, 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 far beyond my field of expertise. I have not read that Guatemalan story, I take it. I'd love to learn more about it. My goal as a comparativist is to go really, really narrow and deep into the Greco-Roman culture, because that's the culture of Jesus. But that doesn't mean that someone, as we said earlier, who wants to go broader and make more synchronic comparisons wouldn't find lots and lots and lots of really interesting stuff. And so I hope you're able to write about that and let us know what you find.
Awesome, Lauren. Thank you. And sorry for butchering half the words on the super chat there. Thank you so much. Pedro, thank you for the super chat. Does Dr. Litwa accept or reject the dying and rising God type, or does he think that other categories are more helpful?
I think that other categories are more helpful. The dying and rising God as a typology was invented by James George Frazer in his multi-volume work, The Golden Bough. And he was depending on mythologies that he was sort of synthesizing mythologies like from anywhere and everywhere, including Australia and Africa, ancient Mesopotamia, and the Americas. And he sort of, he put it all in this one gigantic stew. He was a classicist himself, so he knew the Greek and Roman materials. But the truth is, if you're looking specifically at Greco-Roman culture, dying and rising God isn't really the category in play. There are plenty of suffering deities, and some of those suffering deities do have a corporeal immortalization. So I'm willing to go that far. But in terms of like a universal type where all Greco-Roman people have the idea of a dying and rising God, no, it's not really that typical. And it's best in this case, again, to look at very specific stories rather than categories that are sort of synthetic and invented in the 20th century. It's best just to really dig down deep into the Greek and Roman lore to look for your parallels. And that was my goal. The other thing I'll say about that is that dying and rising God is sometimes, well, it's actually by James George Frazer. It was always connected with the idea that deities increase the fertility of your land, that dying and rising gods increase the fertility of your land. And that idea is utterly absent from the material which I talk about. It has nothing to do with farming or agriculture whatsoever.
Thank you for the answer. I appreciate it. Thank you, Pedro, for that. Let me find our next here. Just going through. Doc's back. He says, given Jesus' divinity reeks of inferior cult influences. Get the book, by the way. Anyway, because in the book he's talking about this, especially with Mrs. Collins, John J. Collins' wife. She has quite a bit to say about this, and you're referencing her while communicating these things. Reeks of emperor cult influences, and the early Judean followers were strict monotheist Jews. Explain Ebionite popularity.
Well, yeah.
Like how did this Jew, and this is a good question, I guess, to make it like, right? How do you have this Jewish type of Christianity that doesn't, it seems like an elbow, like a different odd thing, this Ebionite Christianity.
Yeah, well, as I said, I reject monotheism as a term. That's a 16th century term. It's a modern invention. Jews in antiquity, I would say, I mean, if you're really wanting to protect Christianity from evil pagan influences, you want to really emphasize Jewish monotheism. And we find that very frequently, even in the scholarly literature. As far as I can tell, monotheism just did not exist in antiquity, at least in this very early period of antiquity. There is no one deity. There is a high deity, a sumo deistic pattern. So Yahweh is the high king deity. and he's got a bunch of subordinates. At one point, he had a wife. She disappears, but he has a bunch of subordinates, angels, Gabriel and Michael. He's got a staff that goes around with him, a council of lesser divine beings. Stars are called divine by Jews like Philo. And then you've got whole ranks of angels, and then deified personages like Enoch, who in the Enoch literature becomes a divine being called the Son of the Human, or Son of Man, if you will. And Moses arguably is deified by Philo of Alexandria, so he's a divine being. So this isn't monotheism. So there's no strict monotheism. That just doesn't exist. So we can just boot that out immediately.
Okay.
Explain Ebionite popularity. By Ebionite is another one of these categories that has come into question by modern scholarship. The Ebionite is actually a heresiological term. It's a term that Christian apologists and heresiologists use to smear the reputation of Christians who follow Jewish customs. Mm-hmm. And basically, it's a term of opprobrium. It's kind of a nasty term. You're an Ebionite. So I don't use that term either. I don't deny that there were early Christians who followed Jewish customs, like Saturday Sabbath and circumcision and fasting and dietary laws, kashrut, so on and so forth. I think that Christians definitely in the area of ancient Palestine did those things. Some, I don't think that they were popular. I really don't.
Like the enemies of Paul, maybe Paul's letters. He's dealing with it seems like Judaizers, and they obviously don't win out. The guy who says, "Don't worry about snipping your pecker," he wins. Don't worry.
Yeah. So I mean, this whole category of Jewish Christianity, it's worth more study, but they never become dominant, and I wouldn't grant them the term popularity. And the other thing to mention is, yes, there are influences from the imperial cult. Ancient Christians, as well as modern ones, really don't like acknowledging that there were influences. But if you ever get the chance to go to Turkey or Greece or Rome or some other place and look at a Greco-Roman temple, and just imagine that the whole Mediterranean world during the time of Jesus was covered with these Greco-Roman temples, many of them to rulers. That is, if you go to the Forum in Rome today, you'll see a huge, massive temple to Antoninus Pius and his wife. And they are gods, and they were worshipped as gods, and they had one of the nicest temples in Rome, and it's still standing, so go check it out. And that was everywhere. So how could they escape that influence? They couldn't. Do they want to acknowledge it? No, they don't. And I highly recommend Adela Yarbrough Collins' work. That's gold standard stuff. Go read it.
I'm going to try and email. I actually am doing an interview with Dr. Collins, John J. Collins, tomorrow. So he's going to be on here tomorrow live. I need to twist his arm. And he told me last time, I said, what are the odds you can get your wife to join me for podcast? He goes, email her, in his Irish accent, email her yourself. Don't bother me with it. I'm like, come on, man, help me out. I got to get him on, or got to get her on here. She's brilliant. I read her commentary on Revelation. Oh my goodness. The mythology and it's just amazing. It's amazing. So thank you for the answer. JM, thank you for the super chat. I always appreciate seeing your 2 initials when you're in here. Thank you. I appreciate it. Got another super chat down here. I'm just hitting the super chats. They keep the lights on. Madalia? Oh, Medalia? I hope I'm saying that right. Do you think the fear of death and the desire of immortality of the gods might have influenced the resurrection of Jesus by giving man everlasting life? Thank you for the super chat.
I definitely do think that. And here's one of those rare moments where sort of the history doesn't matter and sort of the universal factors of human psychology does matter. There's a great book, I think it's Ernst Becker, but on the universal fear of human death. And we do things to keep busy, to just forget about death because it's stressful, and we just don't want to think about our non-existence, which is necessary. It's necessarily the fact that we must die, and we don't know what's beyond, and that's a fact. And there's nobody on earth who has special knowledge about that, except the very few who claim to have come back, of course. But even their stories are up for grabs. So yes, absolutely, fear of death is universal. It's built into our brains. We're the only creature on earth who can anticipate our own non-existence, and that's frightening. But when you look across cultures, including Greco-Roman culture, we worship human-like beings who also have something we don't have, that special factor called deathlessness. So we can definitely imagine a whole host of beings who look sort of like human but have deathlessness, and that's very, 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 very common in all cultures, to have gods that look very much like humans, except they live forever. And the ticket to immortality essentially is to have a kind of a situation where somebody transitions from lowly human born to die to immortal deity. And Jesus becomes the paradigm. But he is himself following a whole series of paradigms in Greco-Roman antiquity, where some people, admittedly few, but some, are able to be deified. That is, to have all their human traits preserved, but add eternal life. And definitely, it's a factor. It's a factor. We love that story. That, if you want to argue about anything, that in many ways I hope is a true story. Whether or not it's a literally historically true, that's in a sense not as important as whether that could be existentially true, and whether we need it to be true.
Right. Thank you. You're getting all philosophical on me here. I really do appreciate the answer, and thank you, Medalia. Bill Castle, thank you for the super sticker. I appreciate that, my friend. John Gear, thank you so much. Good to see you here. Would you say the stories of Vespasian curing a blind man at the Serapeum and the stories of Jesus curing a blind man with mud in John are mimetic?
So I talk about this story of Vespasian in How the Gospels Became History. It's a good one. I hope everybody's familiar with it. The Emperor Vespasian in the year 69 goes to Alexandria, and a blind man, well, actually two guys, but one of them is blind, and he asks Vespasian to heal him, interestingly, by putting his bare naked foot on top of him. And this is because Serapis, Serapeum being the temple of Serapis heals people through his feet. So Vespasian is being assimilated to Serapis. And the story is, and it's told by Tacitus, who expresses a bit of skepticism, but he also says that there are witnesses who confirm the story even in his day. So there's it's an eyewitness confirmed miracle. And then you've got this story in John, which occurs probably 20 to 30 years, which is written probably to 20 to 30 years after the Vespasian miracle. So you might say, well, could there be an influence here? I wouldn't say mimetic. Again, mimetic, you have to have high standards for mimetic. Otherwise, mimetic just begins to mean absolutely nothing. So if you want mimetic, you have to look at the details. And in one case, it's mud. In one case, it's healing through the foot. What are the cultural expectations? In one case, is there any other culture that has healings through mud, or any other story that is healings through mud? I don't know. And off the top of my head, I might seek the Septuagint for some kind of mimesis there. In terms of just a general structural parallel, though, it's a perfectly good parallel. And you can definitely say that these stories are similar. But what interests me is the culture that they're coming out of. So why my question is, so in the specific Alexandrian context in which Vespasian is being assimilated to Serapis, he's healing through his foot. And there's eyewitnesses and the whole panoply of things. And then in John, we don't have any eyewitnesses. We're using mud. It seems to be a private event. So why is John, the author of John, choosing to tell the story in this very specific way? Was he thinking of another story? Don't know.
Interesting. Thank you, John, for the super chat. Always appreciate you, man. Good to see you. Dennis Lecker, my buddy, thank you for being here and the super chat. Didn't Greeks and Egyptians recognize a renewal of life via the fertility and dying and rising god Serapis? Looks a lot like Christianity, doesn't it?
Well, in a very general sense, yes. But the point of comparisons is to go really dig down narrow and deep and to look at very, very specific points of comparison. I wouldn't describe the resurrection of Jesus as giving rise to a fertility cult. I mean, a fertility cult typically involves a deity dying, and through that death and resurrection, the land gains fertility. So it's like a farmer's myth, so to speak. It's in the Baal cycle, if you're familiar with Phoenician mythology. That's the story of Baal. He dies and rises, and then the land produces fruit, and that's the point of it. Christians never emphasize anything agricultural whatsoever. And this is the real difference. You've got to, if you're paying attention to similarities, you've got to give due deference to difference. Sorry for that alliteration there, but you've got to look at similarities and differences if you're going to have responsible comparisons. And the fact is, yes, it does look kind of like Christianity, but it also looks kind of different. And Serapis, which is a great example of a very popular Greek-Roman god, is also very local. So to do that comparison responsibly, you'd have to look at local Egyptian Christian culture to see if they are specifically using Serapis or Serapis mythology to build their Christian stories.
Man, this book, I can't get over, I mean, I've been obsessed sinking my mind into it all day. And there are some amazing things you do in chapter 5 where you're dealing with Romulus, which is the last one you're dealing with, Heraclius and Asclepius. And I am still like, what in the world? Like, this is so awesome. And then the fact that they die, right? Even Asclepius is struck by lightning by Jupiter in one account, Zeus in another. Like, it's not a canonized, all right, we've got what we're going to have right out the gate. Christianity kind of develops and canonizes in a way that we don't see with these myths. However, the stories are very likened to what we find in Christianity. And I can't help but think you also mentioned in your book, there's a part where a lot of people go, well, we don't have any earlier sources than like 2nd century or something like this of these stories. How do you deal with that apologetic when people go, well, the earliest we have is 2nd century. We know this reaches way further back into antiquity, though.
Yeah, this is unfortunately very common. Really, the only important century for Christianity is the 2nd century, because that's when most of the literature is written. Now, I mean, you'll have people hedging their bets that the Gospels are all written in the late 1st century, but I mean, you don't know that. I mean, there's no hard dating, but even if it is late 1st century, all the documents become widespread and widely read only in the 2nd. Okay, so I mean, people like to use that farce that Jesus dies in 30, and they sort of view Christianity as like fully developed in the year 30. It's all completely baloney. It was all invented. This whole idea of apostles and church hierarchies and everything that people, and Eucharist and everything that people know about Christianity and value about Christianity today takes generations to develop. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point is Yeah, the stories of Asclepius, Heracles, and Romulus are all much, much, much more ancient than anything in Christianity. Okay, so these stories were known way back as far as the time of Homer. Okay, so that's like 6th, 7th century BCE. If they want to make the argument that some of the stories that we know of were written in the 2nd century, like, I don't know, by Tacitus or something, well, that's fine. But he's obviously using earlier materials. Livy is the one who gives us the report about Romulus. Livy is pre-Christian. He's writing in the 1st century BC. Our knowledge of Heracles comes from tons of sources. Diodorus of Sicily, Apollodorus, all of them are pre-Christian. The Asclepius mythology, again, our sources there are pre-Christian in the main. The stories are obviously pre-Christian. So, yeah, let's stop these games of one-upmanship. It really doesn't do anyone any good whatsoever. The same thing with Pythagoras. Pythagoras is one of my favorites. And the fact is, our full lives of Pythagoras only come from the 4th century, 3rd and 4th century. But they are based on texts that they had, which long predate the New Testament. So they cite their sources, saying, here I'm following the account of so-and-so, who's writing in the 4th century BC, that is 300 years before Christianity. So let's stop with this nonsense about timing.
Do me a favor, if we can, if you have just a little more time, let's do some looking at the New Testament, Jesus and these stories that we find in here, maybe even some in the letters of Paul, whatever, and these figures you mentioned. Let's start with your favorite, Pythagoras. This idea of Jesus saying, cast your net on the other side and gets 153 fish. That's the most well-known, I know, from what I understand, of Pythagoras. But do you know any other comparisons? And can we do that for a moment? Can we compare some of these figures and see what we find in the New Testament?
Yeah, we can. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how long your attention span of your viewers is, but yeah, we can.
We'll jump in the airplane. We'll do like a drive-by. We'll do like a couple cool examples. And
yeah, I mean, first of all, so I'm not a mimesis critic. That doesn't interest me whatsoever. I'm not making genetic connections between texts. That's sort of what a scholar does in his 21st century library.
Right.
What interests me is the ancient dynamic interaction, cultural interaction that we can talk about. And if we can then make some sort of closer connection, that's fine too, if that's what floats your boat. Fishing stories, catching fish, very well-known distinctive stories of Jesus. There's a fishing story for Pythagoras, which you alluded to. It is both similar and different, and you need to pay attention to both. So in Pythagoras's fishing miracle, he sees some fishermen off the shore, and he yells out to them, and he says, guess what, guys? I'm going to tell you exactly how many fish are in your nets right now. Pull it out. So they pull it out, and Pythagoras, essentially, he's a betting man, and he says, if I get the number right, then I get to release the fish back into the water, because killing fish is wrong.
Yeah, isn't it because of reincarnation too? They believe that maybe your ancestors became another animal or something, or
exactly, yeah. So
okay.
he is complete ban on killing animals. So there, right off the bat, you got a difference between Jesus and Pythagoras, because Jesus doesn't seem to give jack squat about killing animals. In fact, he kills about 2,000 pigs. Okay, so there's difference number one. Okay, Jesus and Pythagoras are both sages. Okay, nice general similarity, but in terms of the actual nitty gritty, they got pretty different philosophies. Okay,
right.
So Pythagoras then starts counting the fish on land. And the miracle for Pythagoras is, as long as Pythagoras is in the region of the fish, as long as he's standing with the fish are able to breathe on land, because it takes them a while to count, like 20 minutes or so. And they're all miraculously stay alive. Pythagoras, lo and behold, is exactly right about the number. He then pays the fishermen for the fish and throws them all back in the water. And that's the miracle. It's that the fish remain alive. In the stories of Jesus, it's that they got no fish, and then they got a bunch of fish who all die and are sold for money, and so on and so forth. So the miracle is, wow, he's Lord of the fish. But he doesn't keep them alive. He just, yeah, has them die. So you have similarities and differences. So then if you're interested in mimesis, you're like, oh, okay, well, could these stories influence each other? Well, maybe, but don't just look at the similarities, okay? Look at also the differences and ask yourself why these particular stories were told. What is the point being communicated? For Jesus, it's that he has control over fish. Congratulations. Now, Pythagoras, who is, also has some degree of control over fish. He can keep them alive. But the point is to keep them alive, because that's the philosophy. You do not kill any other living creature. So there's Jesus and Pythagoras. They're both fishermen of sorts. But if Pythagoras, to be more accurate, is sort of like the anti-fisherman. Pythagoras is not a fishing man.
Is the 153 that's a perfect triangular number? Is there any significance? Because Pythagoras is very mathematical, from what I understand.
Yes, it would be wonderful to find a story in which we knew the number of fish that Pythagoras said. But actually, when you look at the stories, we know that he told them a number, but we don't know what the number was. So so it's a little bit like grasping at straws. Yes, 153 is a triangular number. So maybe in the John version, the Johannine version of chapter 21, where we get the 153 number, maybe that's the very, 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 very subtle hint that this is a Pythagorean miracle. But since we don't have confirming evidence that 153 was actually in the other Pythagoras stories, there's just no way to confirm it. So I don't want to burst anyone's bubble, but you have to be honest with the data and act a little bit like a scientist. We have to, our imaginations will run wild like horses. Yeah. And the point of scholarship is to say, no, let's not be like an apologist. Let's not just ram over the data to get what we want. Let's actually say either we have the hard evidence or we don't. And speculation, intuition is not enough for scholarship.
Let's talk about Hercules real quick here, or Hercules real quick, because I know that we could spend a lot of time on these, but making it brief and simple in comparison. What are some clear comparisons that you mentioned in the book? You go in far more depth, but with Hercules, we'll do it with the three main characters you described in your presentation, if you don't mind.
Well, so Hercules is the Roman name, and Heracles is the Greek name. Same dude, just a slightly different transposition of the vowel there. So Heracles, I will just use the Greek guy. Heracles is the most famous Greek hero of all time, and in fact, he's so famous that he's even got modern movies and cartoons after him. I mean, he is absolutely hands down the best known hero of all antiquity. Everybody from Spain to Palestine knows about Heracles and knows that he had 12 labors and knows that he had a divine birth. He knows that he ascended to heaven. Right. And he is a suffering deity. His 12 labors involve him in tremendous suffering. And his
there's a cult like attached to the suffering deity concept of Hercules, correct?
Well, I mean,
or followers.
It tends to be that suffering gods are fairly rare in Greek culture, because Greeks like to imagine their deities as sort of like invincible, and so when you have a suffering deity, your eyes widen a bit. And I would say that one of the reasons why Heracles appealed to the common person was that they knew that he had suffered like them. And so he was able to answer prayers because he knew what your prayers were about. He had experienced human life. He had gone through a bunch of suffering. He had experienced injustice. And so he knew human needs and human pain. And that's what made him one of the most popular deities to pray to.
Makes me
And
think that's why Jesus became so popular too, is that empathizing and knowing what it's like to suffer idea.
exactly. Yeah. So that's right in the letter to the Hebrews. That's said very directly that he's able to sympathize with human beings because he was one, or he is one, but he's also got he's also a God. Explain that one. But so the issue is you've got someone who a suffering deity and also a dying deity, and there's really no specific story that I would say that I would really point up and say, you know, here's where Heracles looks a lot like Jesus. Maybe some of your viewers want to mention something, but to my mind, the closest you can get is maybe how he died. He burns himself alive in a very public event on top of a mountain, and then his father Zeus vindicates him by taking up his divine element, giving him an immortal body, and having him rise to heaven, and then sitting him down in glory in heaven and giving him a new wife and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, the fact that his wife and kids, like you talk about in your book, is evidence that he has a body. You know, this is a whole nother.
Yeah. No, yeah, he has a body. It's just a heavenly one. It's right. It's a kind of substance. If you punch it, it's not just thin air, but it's also a kind of flesh that's spirit flesh. It's not damaged by anything.
And you mentioned a connection. There's so much more you go into here in the book. I'm really just trying to kind of tease people so that they can get their hands on this material. It goes far in depth. Romans 1:4, where Paul talks about he's a son of God because of his crucifixion, his resurrection. I apologize, because of his resurrection. What is that connection, if you will, that makes sense to Hercules here?
Well, the fact that the normal process of humans is, of course, to die, and your soul goes downward. That's the Greek view. It still is kind of sort of the Christian view, and so to have a divine element, first of all, is a little bit distinctive, and to have that divine element be given a deathless body that rises to heaven, that's something quite distinctive. That happens to Heracles and a few other people. And I would argue that it also happens to Jesus. And for all of those stories, we don't know exactly what the tellers of those stories meant. But if Christianity is an analogy, it probably meant something like this. Most of us are going to die and go down to Hades and be judged. But if we are especially good or strong or faithful or virtuous, then there's a chance that the divine element that we've cultivated in us will rise, inherit a new body, and we will dwell as super beings in a celestial ecology. Mm-hmm. And that Heracles, in other words, is a model for those very special few who can do well in life and become sons of Zeus, as we might say, by grace and hard work, and even if not by nature.
Heracles, I love this show today. I'm turning it into Heracles. The new curse word is Heracles. We're not going to say, Jesus, I love this show. We're going to start doing something else here, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate this. Look, a couple super chats, and then I'm going to ask publicly. I'm going to ask everyone to like the video, go get the book, and Dr. Litwa, please come back. Please do not leave us. We're not ready for you to go. And please don't respond with what Romulus had to say. I was there with the gods before, and in my time here was short, and I have to go back. No, we need you here longer than this, okay? But not tonight. Not tonight. We're going to do this again. I asked that we do this again. You, me, and Neil, we got to start doing these more because you have so much information I don't think the internet world has seen. I really don't. I'm telling you, your books are like hiding on a shelf somewhere collecting dust, and they need more attention. I swear on it. So, Doc Pleroma, thank you for the super chat. Back to decent tradition. What about the now lost Orphic Pythagorean myth about the descent of Orpheus to Hades?
Yep, this is an important one. Orpheus, as many of your viewers know, lost his wife to a snake bite, and he makes an agreement that he's able to go down to Hades, and he makes a deal with the king of Hades, who is also named Hades, and his wife Persephone. Because he plays such lovely music, they decide to give him his wife back, but their only requirement is that he not look back the whole ascent back up unto the upper world.
Sounds like some story I know. Pillar of salt type. I'm not saying it's identical. I'm not doing a mimetic thing everywhere. I'm just saying it sounds like something here. Like, don't look back, don't look back. Anyway,
right. So yes, at the very last moment, she trips or something. I'm a bit foggy there, but Orpheus looks back, sees her lovely face as it's being pulled back into the depths of Hades forever. Orpheus then becomes a misogynist and is killed by women by having his head ripped off. It's a fun story. Now, is this descent tradition in any way related to descent traditions for Jesus? Well, I think so. I think there's a general cultural idea that superhero kind of figures can go down to Hades and back. Heracles does it. He brings up the Hound of Hades. And there's this great story. Unfortunately, it was never canonized, but if you read the Acts of Pilate, or sometimes known as the Gospel of the Egyptians, there's a big story of Jesus goes down to heaven, and he goes down to hell, or the Hades, and death and Satan have this long conversation. And this was, and essentially Jesus comes down there, says, "Hey guys, I'm here, and you good people who have been stuck down here in prison for the past few thousand years, sorry about that. I'm going to do something about that and redeem you, etc., etc., etc." And then he goes to heaven. So is there some sort of one-upmanship here? Probably, actually, because Orpheus fails and Jesus succeeds, right? Because he's able to bring people back fully, right? And of his own power. So you've got to be thinking to yourself, where Orpheus failed, it's not in his power to take his wife back. He has to do a little, jig and sing a tune and to do that. And then at the last minute, he loses her. Well, that's not what happens for Jesus. Jesus takes up everybody who's righteous since Adam and Eve. And bada bing, bada boom, Christianity is a whole lot better. So you see why the myth was told. They're already playing one-upmanship games with Orpheus. I don't know if you describe that as mimetic. I guess maybe that might be mimetic, sure. But the point is that these are stories in competition. So, and so this is an apologetic edge. These are stories where Christians are trying to say, here's where our hero is better.
Thank you so much, Doc. Man, wonderful questions. I mean, he's digging deep. Thank you. Dennis has one more, and then I'm going to let you go here on the out. Dennis Leckert, thank you, my friend. In terms Carrier would get without explaining the full T bays, what % of M and M, Luke, and J plus Paul derives via the Old Testament as opposed to the Greek myths? You understand the question?
Well, this is, Bayes' theorem. Yeah, I to be honest, Richard Carrier's a whole lot better at math than I am. So I'm going to leave Bayes' theorem to him.
Okay.
Now, but the important thing is that, when you're doing mimesis, if you're interested in mimesis, that your most important source probably isn't the Greco-Roman material. It is the Septuagint. Now, one could argue, actually, that the Septuagint is a product of Greco-Roman culture. I mean, it's written by Jews and then translated into Greek. And, as they're translating, they're changing things. Mm-hmm. And these are Hellenized people making the translation. So the Septuagint it's literally written in Greek, which is the language of the gospel writers. And it has some interesting additions and updates and changes that are really worth studying. So if you want to see, and this is what the gospel writers are most familiar with. So your obvious port of call is to well, learn Greek and read the Septuagint. Or actually, there's fairly good translations of the Septuagint, which are different than modern translations of the Old Testament. That's important to keep in mind. So if you pull up, if you're using a modern Bible, that's all based on the Hebrew text.
Yeah.
Whereas you want to go to your library and get an actual translation of the Greek text, which is what the early Christians were reading. So that's important to keep in mind. It's a very different book. So what percent? Well, really, this isn't a numbers game, actually. It would be very hard to sort of make this into a mathematical model and computerize this. This is really, the more and more I study this, learning, this is really a discipline of the humanities, not about hard math and science. This is something that everyone is going to subjectively disagree with, okay? Anyone you meet, okay? So to give a percent really gives the wrong idea, because seeing what a parallel is, either with the Septuagint or with the Greco-Roman material, people disagree on what's a true parallel.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have to ask your question, you know, if you've got similarities and differences, and we've taken adequate attention to both, well, I don't know, what counts as a parallel? If there are, you know, say, more differences than similarities, or the similarities are very general, but the differences are very specific. So when you're asking about derivation, this really isn't how the human mind works. You may learn a story that you knew from childhood, and then when you create a new story, you may be even unconsciously bringing in knowledge of the story you knew since you were a kid. And then as you're, say you're a novelist or something like that, and you know, you're like C.S. Lewis, who reads the Bible and then writes the story of Aslan, which is really an allegory about Jesus. And consciously or unconsciously, you may include materials that you know, you wouldn't even call it derivation per se, because it's not like you've got one book open and then another book open and you're sort of copying point by point to create the new story. No, I mean, the old story is in here somewhere. It's been there for years and years and years, and you remember reminiscences of it, and then it comes out in your new story.
And I would even argue, like especially if these authors are reading Greek and writing Greek, they're going to be acquainted with Homer. They're going to be acquainted with these things. So it's in the air and culturally. So like it's there. I think that the biggest battle we have isn't between people like you and Dennis McDonald. I think you guys are on the same side. Even if you go, I wouldn't go that far, but I definitely agree with him on this. And Dennis might go, at least you're agreeing with this. I'm not going to lie. This is what he told me. He's like, at least you're agreeing with it being there, right? Well, what's going on, I think, that frustrates me as I've been investigating this is when I'm reading the commentaries, unless I'm reading Pervo and Acts or something where he's willing to go in places that isn't in the Septuagint alone, the commentators aren't mentioning the things you discussed in this show today. Like they're not at least granting this might be an echo or seems from the culture of the Greco-Roman world that this can be the influence. No, it's Zechariah 12, verse 3. It's only exclusively one way and not eclectic. They don't see this eclectic cultural milieu that you describe in the opening as you get into your methodology, which I highly recommend anyone who's going to read this. Sure, you could skip to chapter 5, get all the exciting information. But if you don't know how the methodology is, you can't see how this Hellenistic world isn't either or. It is much more you used the word syncretism, I think, somewhere in there, something like that. It's hybrid. Yeah, it's not either or. And it's hard for me with my thinking to get out of that habit. It's tough. It's very tough because every scholar I talked to, Del Allison Jr., I saw him 2-3 months ago in person at his Yale Divinity. He's not Yale. He's at Princeton, yeah. Wonderful guy. I mean, I love Dell. He's amazing. And I asked him about some of this Greek stuff, and he's like, Derek, I'm not going to lie. I learned Greek to read and study Greek, and I've been doing it since 1970 something. And I'm like, woo. I said, you're my dad, you know, or you could be my dad. And he's like, but I've always taken it to the Hebrew Bible or to the Septuagint. I've never been trained as a scholar to even think, let me go outside of that.
Yeah, that's the scholarly
scholarship.
reflex. Yeah, because Judaism is the buffer. So you own the as the history of apologetics has changed the structure of education in America, less so other places. But the apologetic argument that Judaism is a buffer and that's the stuff that you compare, the Jewish stuff, and just forget about the Greco-Roman stuff. We didn't even know about that stuff. Is the way that education is structured. And it's so ludicrous. I mean, you have to do all this study yourself. Even if you go to a PhD program, you have to be proactive and say, you know what, I'm going to take classes in Greek and Roman mythology rather than a class in Old Testament. Or, well, you should take both. Mm-hmm. But the fact is, on your required list, you'll have, Hebrew Bible as a required class, but you won't have anything on classic mythology. You won't have anything on Tacitus, Plutarch. You wouldn't even know who these people are, even going through graduate school. So you have to be proactive, and you have to take education into your own hands, and learn it yourself, and do your best. And this is a great platform to get that started. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody who's in the chat. Hit the like button while you're here. There's like 436 of you. I think we peaked out at 490 between Facebook and YouTube. We almost hit 500 people watching. Go David Litwa, Amazon.com. Here, I'll make sure I paste it in the chat right now while I have it lifted up. Tease you with these amazing, amazing books. I'm telling you, we're going to get through all of these right now. My good friend Neil and Gnostic Informant just did an interview on Hermetica 2. Blew my mind. I'm like, oh, there's got to be like a part 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I mean, there's so much here. And we also did How the Gospels Became History, you and I, and The Evil Creator, talking about Sethianites and all sorts of really interesting Christianities. You have a book coming out. I want to give a tease. You have a book coming out. Neil told me about it because you didn't tell me about it yet. What is this book that you have coming out, and why did you title it Found Christianities?
Well, yeah, so it's a very well-known book by Bart Ehrman is Lost Christianities, and it's sort of like Bart works with a competition model, and he sort of views the 2nd century as this time of great polemic, and some Christianities, in fact, most of them lost, and then there was just one version that won out. And so I wrote a book telling you about all those Christianities which were de-Christianized, and I want to make the point that those Christianities still in many ways survive today in our thinking, that they never really died. And it's not really ultimately that helpful to say that, just one form of Christianity lived. Because if we do the research, we can find all the different forms of Christianity that existed in antiquity. And they were many, and they were wild, and they were fun. And I go through in 25 chapters, and I tell you about those Christianities, the ones that through evidence we have found, and explain what they thought, what their influence was, and why they're still important today.
So I will admit this is definitely pricey, but let me tell you how this can change. And I mean this, everybody who's listening, if you can't afford it, nobody's blaming you. Trust me. And these are not his numbers. He wishes he didn't have these numbers on here. Trust me. We've talked in private. We've talked publicly about this. Found Christianities, go to your nearest library, okay, and tell them, I want this book. I want this book tomorrow. And, of course, they're not going to give it to you tomorrow. That's the downside, okay? They're not going to give it to you tomorrow, but they're going to give it to you. They're going to get you the book so you don't have to pay an arm and a leg to get it. I'm so excited. Everything that you say just keeps blowing my mind. I really want everybody to get the book to help support what you're doing, Dr. Litwa. I want you to become a mainstream, well-known, popular scholar who can popularize these ideas for the world to see and understand a better, I think it's just a better way of kind of putting the magnifying glass on this time. And I thank you. I really do.
Thank you, Derek. It's a great platform to get the word out. Really appreciate it.
We're going to spread the gospel this way. Hallelujah. Also, he's got the blog here. I really appreciate everybody going and checking out his blog. It's in the description. So if you're watching this later and you didn't see this live, go down there, support him in any way possible. The best you could do is really sharpen your mind by reading the works that he has. I can't tell you, it's amazing. It really is. And I thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your energy. Dr. Litwa, any final words, my friend?
No, just an exhortation to your listeners. Again, there's a lot of superficial information out there on the web. I know that it's confusing. I know that it's hard to sift through because you don't know who's reliable. And really exhort all of you to hear both sides of the story. Don't stop in your journeys. Really become a researcher and learn the disciplines of mind that you need to hear the full side of the story and make your own decisions. And I hope in my books and these shows can help everybody and everyone who's interested, who has a hunger for true knowledge, to really pursue this. So thanks.
I have to say amen at the end of that. This has been a fantastic show. Thank you for your time.